In the Middle Ages, the Black Death killed millions across Europe, Asia, and Africa. When a plague outbreak hit, people did what they could to protect themselves. Some turned to prayer and God's mercy. Others fled their hometowns, hoping the countryside was safer than the crowded cities. But a few went another way, fighting the deadly disease with an equally deadly weapon, fear. They were plague doctors, men and women who donned terrifying masks and outfits and ventured into the sickest parts of town. Their mission, to heal plague victims or perhaps to simply spread more fear. Let's start with that iconic beaked mask, the symbol of medieval plague doctors. It looked intimidating, mysterious, and maybe even a little cool, until you had to wear it. These bird-like masks weren't just for show. They were stuffed with herbs, spices, and dried flowers to purify the air. In case the thick leather covering your entire face wasn't enough to block out the stench of death and decay. The idea was that the plants would absorb the bad air, making it safer for the wearer to, feel better, I guess. But inside, it was hot, claustrophobic, and impossible to breathe. Imagine inhaling the same recycled, sweaty air all day with a hint of old rosemary and despair. Now, imagine trying to do your job with that. Yeah, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Worse, the narrow eye holes and foggy glass lenses made it hard to see anything clearly. Plague doctors had to fumble through dark alleys and sick rooms, squinting like they'd lost their glasses at the worst possible time. And I bet you've never lost your glasses at the worst possible time. Well, if you have, imagine doing that while tending to a patient who might die in front of you. To make matters worse, plague doctors weren't exactly popular. People didn't see them as healers, but as omens. If a plague doctor walked into your town, it meant people were about to die. So naturally, some villagers threw rocks at them. Imagine trudging around in a leather cloak, wearing a beak mask that smells like a dead herb garden and dodging angry mobs, while trying to help people who probably won't survive. You might think these outfits were designed by sadistic sadists or evil witches, but actually they were designed by physicians. That's right, actual doctors created these things. These terrifying outfits were based on a medical theory called the miasma theory. This theory stated that diseases like the plague were caused by bad air or foul smells. This sounds kind of right? Like, yeah, cholera is pretty stinky. But the theory was wrong. Most diseases aren't spread by smells. They're spread by germs, and these germs are invisible, but that didn't stop physicians from banding together in the 1800s and declaring war on bad smells. They created the International Health Board, whose members wore disguises like this one and spent their days fumigating sewers, burning piles of trash, and inspecting food for signs of rot. Because nothing says, "I smell disease," like a pile of weak old garbage. The board's leader, Charles Delorme, was so concerned about germs that he wore one of these outfits everywhere he went. Even when he went to parties, he'd show up in full plague doctor regalia, beak mask, and all. Partygoers were less than thrilled. After all, nobody wants to dance with the guy in the creepy mask. Deform's obsession with cleanliness got so bad that he scrubbed his hands raw. Then he developed a nervous habit of biting his fingernails. Soon his fingers bled and he couldn't scrub anymore. So he put on gloves, then more gloves, and then a full-length leather suit. Finally, he added the finishing touch, a beak mask made of leather and linen. His friends thought he was joking, but he was serious. This was his new everyday outfit. He wore it for years, even after he lost his sense of smell. So why did plague doctors wear such creepy costumes? Because they thought it would keep them safe from invisible germs. They looked cool, maybe, but they weren't very practical. They were hot, itchy, and made it really hard to do your job. But sometimes the most inconvenient part was the mask. I mean, can you imagine trying to eat lunch in that thing? Well, some plague doctors didn't have to because someone else did the eating for them. See, when the plague hit, some wealthy people hired servants to do their dirty work for them, including eating their food. After all, who else would eat the food of a rotting corpse? These brave souls were paid handsomely, given fancy meals and fine wine, and allowed to live outside the infected city walls. All they had to do was bring the food to the sick person and watch them eat it. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. But wait a minute, why not just feed the sick person yourself and avoid getting close enough to, die? Well, These rich folks were worried about looking weak in front of their servants, so they paid extra to have someone else eat their food for them. Someone with a higher social status than a servant, someone like a physician. So, if you were a doctor during the plague, you might get a knock at your door one day and find a servant holding out a plate of food. They'd say something like, "Would you do me a great favor and eat my master's dinner?" He's too weak to touch a morsel of food, but you look hearty enough to finish it all. And you're thinking, "Nope, sorry. I do undo takeout, and you definitely not paying me enough to eat your master's food." But the plague doctor, well, he was desperate. Maybe he'd been turned down a dozen times already. Maybe he was hungry. Maybe he needed the money. Whatever the reason, he took the plate of food, sat next to the sick person, and ate every last bite. It was hot, uncomfortable, and probably the last meal he'd ever eat. But hey, someone had to do it. For more on what life was like during the plague, stay tuned. The Black Death is coming. What can we do to stop it? Well, first we need to talk about what didn't work. And it almost feels wrong to start this list with our favorite specialist, the plague doctors. It's like a bad Yelp review. You know what's coming, but you read it anyway because you're morbidly curious. And boy, do these reviews deliver. Now, let's peek into the plague doctor's kit. You'd think it would be full of life-saving instruments, right? Wrong. Most of it was pure guesswork, superstition, and outright horror. Take the famous lancet, basically a sharp knife for slashing open veins. Doctors believed that letting blood would cure everything from headaches to consumption, aka tuberculosis. To take just one example, there was the idea of balancing your humors, which proposed that the body had 4 humors or fluids, yellow and black bile, phlegm, and blood. Now, if you got sick, that meant that one or more of those humors was out of whack. So they figure out which one needed adjusting and then use methods like bloodletting to bring your humors back into balance. What could go wrong? Well, everything. For starters, there was no way to tell whose humors were off balance or how far out of whack they were. The only common symptom of these imbalances seemed to be fever. So any treatment for a fever might also increase the number of people who died from the fever. Also, cutting open a vein is a good way to make someone weaker and sometimes to kill them. This brings us to our next tool, the long wooden stick. Not for walking, oh no. They were used to poke patients from a distance. Think of it like medieval social distancing. If you had buboes, those big black boils that came with the plague, the doctor might lance them, drain them, or just gently whack them with a stick. Yikes. But it gets worse. Some doctors carried jars of dried toads, which they ground up into powders and mixed into ointments. Supposedly these could help with eye or ear pain. But it's hard to say if the treatments were more disgusting than their side effects. Even worse, some doctors wore amulets to protect themselves from the plague. Which is kind of funny if you're an actual medical professional watching this. But the worst part is none of it worked. Not one treatment cured the plague. Small wonder that the plague doctors failed where common folk sometimes succeeded. After all, most of those treatments consisted of rest, clean air, and water, and not murdering each other. So why did these treatments fail? As with so many things in medieval science, there was a knowledge gap. The problem is we don't know what the gaps were. Plague doctors were often employed by wealthy patients, meaning that their failures probably didn't get around as easily as their successes would have. We have some clues as to why certain treatments were attempted, but nothing concrete. We do have records of physicians like Guy de Chauliac, who wrote extensively about the plague and its supposed cures, including recipes for ointments containing things like crushed emeralds, powdered bones, and random bits of animal fat. Crushed emeralds may sound weird, but they weren't unheard of in medieval medicine. Since people thought that the green color could treat eye problems and heal wounds, powdered bones were popular too, since people thought that since bone dust was light and airy, it could help with congestion and lung ailments. Animal fat was used for similar reasons. That is, there was no real reason except people thought it would work. As for the plague doctor's bloodiest tools, well, bloodletting was standard practice in medieval medicine, so there was no shortage of reasons why a physician might recommend it. Maybe they really did believe it balanced the humors, or maybe they just wanted to avoid treating the patient. At the time, physicians had no surefire treatments for the plague. So if they couldn't cure a patient, they at least didn't want to make things worse. In fact, the whole profession of plague doctor was something of a gamble. Treating a patient usually meant going to their house and performing a ritual of treatments, whether they helped or not. And you were always holding a bag of medieval nonsense. Was it the emerald powder or the toad oil that cured the patient, or was it the placebo effect? Or maybe it was divine intervention. You were never quite sure. But you were always there from house to house, pretending that you were. Want to know more about why medieval medicine was so gross? Check out the series in the description below. A plague doctor walks through a deserted street. The year is 1665 and London is in the throes of bubonic plague. All around him are signs of suffering and death. Here one might think a brave soul is needed, a healer who will fight for his fellow man despite the danger. But what if this doctor is more afraid than he's willing to let on? Let's find out. Now picture this. You're walking through a plague-ridden town. The streets are eerily quiet, save for the occasional scream or the cry of someone begging for help. But above all, it's the smell that hits you. Rotting garbage, unwashed bodies, dead rats, and decaying corpses, all simmering under a summer sun. Public sanitation? Never heard of it. Sewage flowed in open ditches. And people dumped their waste right out of windows. Guard as low, they'd shout, a fancy way of saying, look out below. As a plague doctor, your job was to visit homes filled with the sick and dying. Many of these homes were sealed shut. You'd walk in, and the stench of death would practically knock you over. People lay in piles, moaning, coughing, or already gone, with blackened limbs and swollen lymph nodes. You couldn't really help them, but you had to document the deaths, perform last rites, or give treatment anyway. Every home you entered, you risked catching the disease yourself. Even though your mask was stuffed with flowers, it did nothing against airborne bacteria. But no one knew that yet. You were supposed to be the brave doctor. But deep down, you were terrified. And it showed in every slow step you took through streets that reeked of despair. You feel a growing dread as you approach a new house on your rounds. It's a modest 2-story building, but the sight that greets you on the ground floor sends a chill down your spine. 3 men are slumped against the wall, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes blank and staring. They're not praying, you realize with a jolt, they're dead. Their lips are pulled back in a silent scream. And that's when you see it, a black spot on one of the dead men's arms, the telltale sign of the plague. Your heart pounds in your chest as you ask yourself, should you turn back? But duty calls and you move forward. Your eyes fixed on the grim scene before you. The stench of death clings to the air like a shroud as you step inside. In the corner, you see a woman kneeling beside a small fire, her head bowed in prayer. Beside her lies a child, his breathing shallow and raspy. She looks up at you, her face etched with worry. Please, doctor, you have to help him, she begs, her voice cracking with emotion. But you can do little more than offer kind words and a prayer yourself because you know that the plague has taken a strong hold on the child. You reach out to check his pulse, but the woman stops you with a desperate plea. Don't leave, she cries. I beg of you, stay with us. Her words hang in the air, heavy with fear and sorrow. You understand her terror, but you're torn. Your own safety hangs in the balance, and the thought of leaving is a tempting one. Yet something in the woman's pleading eyes holds you there. And so you stay, watching over the dying child, knowing that you may be putting yourself in harm's way, but unable to look away from the heartbreaking scene before you. As the hours pass, the child's breathing grows weaker, and you feel a sense of helplessness wash over you. There's nothing more you can do, it's up to fate now. The woman thanks you for your kindness and tells you to go to save others. So you leave, stepping out into the bustling marketplace. You try to shake off the heaviness of the house, but it clings to you like a second skin. Everywhere you turn, you see reminders of the plague. In the haggard faces of the crowd, in the shuttered windows of the shops, even in the vacant stare of a cat slinking through the market. Each step you take, the dread of another gruesome discovery grows. What other horrors await you in this plague-ridden town? Will you succumb to the disease yourself? Or can you keep going? Despite the mounting fear, you press on. Driven by a sense of purpose and an ounce of morbid curiosity. After all, what else is there to do? The Black Death is history's most infamous plague. It killed millions. But life during an outbreak wasn't just miserable for the victims, it was also incredibly lonely. See, if you were a plague doctor, you weren't part of the regular community. In many towns, you were hired from far away because locals did not want to risk sending one of their own into the plague zone. Plague doctors traveled from town to town, hired to treat outbreaks only to show up carrying more death with them than they left behind. Once hired, you were essentially locked in with the infected. You couldn't leave the city. Travel was forbidden. Letters were burned before being opened. You ate alone, slept alone, and tried not to touch anything, including yourself. No friends, no family, no small talk. All you had was the endless toll of death bells and the scratch of your pen as you recorded yet another body. People didn't treat you like a hero. They looked at you like a curse. You couldn't remove your uniform in public. And if you started showing symptoms, you kept working. After all, there was no one else. This plague doctor painting by an unknown artist shows the kind of protective clothing plague doctors wore. The outfit included a coat, a mask, a hat, and gloves. The coat had to be worn over your regular clothes and was tucked in to keep out the drafts. The mask had glass eyes to see through and was filled with aromatic substances to purify the air. The hat had a stiff brim to keep rain and flies off your face. And the gloves were made of leather so you could still feel your fingers. But no matter how much protection you had, it was impossible to avoid contamination. So even if you survived one outbreak, people wouldn't trust you. After all, you had been too close to death. Some plague doctors were even blamed for spreading the plague. So why would anyone take this job? Well, the pay was good. When the rich hired plague doctors, they paid well, handsomely. And many plague doctors came from poor backgrounds, so it was hard to pass up. There was also the prestige. You weren't just some lowly physician who treated the sick. You were a specialist, a plague specialist, which meant you spent less time dealing with the living and more time with the dead, which sounds depressing, but death was everywhere. Back then, the idea of death was much different than it is now. Funerals were massive events. Friends and family gathered to mourn, drink, dance, and feast. Death was a part of life. And unlike today, children could understand it. By the time you were 5 years old, you probably buried a sibling or a parent. And as a kid, you would have attended their funeral and accepted that death is inevitable. Being a plague doctor didn't mean you avoided death. It just meant you dealt with it more than most. The main goal of a plague doctor was to stop the spread of disease. To do that, you needed to identify the sick and the healthy. And to do that, you needed to be close to death. During the Black Death, a third of Europe died. It was easy to tell if someone was infected. You just looked for swollen lymph nodes, weakness, and fever. Treatment varied. Sometimes blood was taken, sometimes opium was given. Sometimes people were wrapped in hot towels, and sometimes they were put on display, paraded around town to show everyone that they were sick. But none of these treatments worked. Your job as a plague doctor was to watch people die. And if you watched enough, you started to see patterns, the stages of death. At first, the victims were weak, then they were feverish. Then they bled, then they went blind, and then they died. And if you watched enough, you also started to become immune. Plague doctors who survived an outbreak rarely got sick again. That's why they were hired. Being a plague doctor was dangerous, but it wasn't just the disease you had to worry about. There were angry mobs, villagers who thought you were poisoning wells or spreading the plague on purpose. It was hard to convince people that death was inevitable, that the plague was God's will. When the Black Death ravaged England, France, and Italy, people turned on the plague doctors. They were chased out of villages, sometimes stoned, sometimes hanged. It was a lonely job, but someone had to do it. And maybe it was the worst part of all, no one wanted to do it. You were a necessary evil, a modern-day hazmat team, a specialist in death. It's one thing to face danger. It's another to do it in isolation. Without support, in a society that sees you as part monster, part priest, part fool. And that's what made it unbearable. What do you do when the entire population of your city is being wiped out by an invisible killer? If you're a medieval European town, you hire a doctor to come help you figure it out. Well, really, you hire a scientist, but everyone calls them a doctor. That's what we'll call them too. It helps us keep track of them. You see, plague doctors were the front line of defense against the plague. A disease so deadly it killed an estimated 25 million people in the 14th century alone. That means that somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population was wiped out. So it makes sense that cities would offer these scientists lucrative contracts to help combat the disease. But how much did plague doctors make? Let's find out. The pay for plague doctors varied depending on where they traveled. Rural areas and poorer towns typically didn't pay very much at all, but wealthier cities were desperate to stop the plague and keep their population growing. So these places offered big contracts to entice the best and brightest minds to come help them. For example, in 1656, the town council of Marseille offered the equivalent of 30,000 euros to anyone who could discover the cause of the plague and find a cure. The contract also came with a nice home and hazard pay, which was probably necessary because that same year, an English physician named Guy de la Bédoyère recommended burning all the cats and dogs in the city. As animals couldn't catch the plague, he reasoned they must be the source of infection. Okay, that didn't work. But if you stuck it out and survived the outbreak, you'd probably get paid. Of course, this was easier said than done because outbreaks could last months or even years. And the average life expectancy of a plague doctor wasn't great. Many never saw a single coin. But once the danger had passed, the city of Marseille coughed up the cash. Or not, because in 1662, after the plague finally retreated from the city, Marseille refused to pay a Dr. Famine for his services, stating that because he had died on the job, they owed him nothing. Yikes. So it was important to read the fine print because some cities would refuse to pay anyone who died before the contract was finished, and there were other problems too. We already talked about the fine print issue, but you might be surprised to hear that sometimes doctors were paid in things other than gold. Land, for example, was a common currency. And one time a plague doctor was paid with a plague-infested house. Lovely. So it seems some properties were so tainted by disease and death that no one wanted them. So the local government would offer it to whoever was willing to treat the sick there. And if you took the deal, you were probably doing it for the exposure, the prestige, or maybe you just liked houses. But this meant that instead of getting rich, you might be saddled with an undesirable property. And if you were still standing at the end of the outbreak, congratulations. You may have been too contaminated to work with the healthy again. After all, you've been in the middle of a massive pandemic. Most plague doctors weren't physicians anyway, so they didn't exactly have job options afterward. They were too exhausted to care. So, for most plague doctors, their time spent fighting the plague was effectively lost work. At the very least, they could probably get a statue. Plague doctors are almost always remembered with those big, creepy masks they wore, not because they were necessarily bad at their jobs, but because their efforts were almost always in vain. In the end, they were often penniless, sick, and widely hated. I'm sure a few of you watching right now are thinking, wait a second. If plague doctors were so risky to hire, why not just hire someone else? Well, the answer is simple. There were no qualified candidates. For centuries, physicians knew very little about the plague and even less about how to stop it. Treatments were more art than science, and most doctors had absolutely no idea what they were doing. So if you were sick, you were on your own. Even the wealthiest people in Europe couldn't escape the plague, though some did try. And boy, did that go about as well as you'd expect? To learn more about how the plague affected the rich and famous, check out the series in the description below. Because while the plague may have killed millions, it also created some pretty incredible stories. Hey, thanks for watching. Hey, like the video. If you loved it, please don't hesitate to show us with a like and comment. And if you want to see more from our channel, check out the series in the description below. See you next time. The plague doctor was one of the most terrifying figures of the Middle Ages. Armed with a cane, a beak mask, and a grim prognosis, he was the harbinger of death's chill touch. But what if I told you his job was even worse than it seems? What if I told you there was a price so ghastly it transcended even the macabre? Buckle up because I am about to take you down the rabbit hole of the plague doctor's worst nightmare. Let me paint you a picture. It's the 14th century, and you find yourself in a medieval village gripped by the Black Death. Homes are boarded up, streets are deserted, and the air is thick with fear. Suddenly, a knock on the door brings a sliver of hope. It's the plague doctor, come to offer his services. But as the door opens, you're hit with a stench of decay. Underneath the layers of wax and leather, the doctor is already a vessel of the very disease he's come to fight. He's part of a long line of physicians who unwittingly spread the plague through their treatments. Bloodletting, the dominant medical practice of the time, only hastened the disease's spread. You let the doctor in and he begins the ritual. With each passing moment, the clock is ticking. Not just for your health, but for the life of the physician. You see, plague doctors were contracted workers. They arrived in villages with their own supplies and took rooms in local inns. In return, they expected complete immersion in the local community, sharing its joys and sorrows equally. And nowhere was this more pronounced than during funerals. Plague doctors were required to attend every funeral within the village limits, regardless of their own health status. So, as you watch the villagers bury their dead, you're not just mourning the loss of life. You're also trapping your plague doctor deeper into the heart of the epidemic. And as the days pass, you realize the gravity of the situation. For plague doctors weren't just exposed to the living, they were also in constant contact with the dead. They examined cadavers, both for the purpose of medical study and to determine the cause of death. This was a necessary evil, a means to better understand and combat the plague, but it came at a terrible cost. Each examination pushed the doctor closer to the brink, not just physically, but mentally as well. Imagine the toll on their psyche, the haunting images seared into their memory, forever blurring the line between life and death. As the plague doctor continues his rounds, he's not just a healer, he's a walking paradox, dispensing treatments that are more hindrance than help. His remedies, rooted in an age-old belief in balancing humors, do little to stave off the plague. And as the death toll rises, so does the desperation. Villagers turn on him, blaming him for their suffering, for the loved ones they've lost. They see him as an outsider, a stranger in a mask, and they lash out. He becomes a target, a scapegoat for their pain. And then there are the risks he faces daily. The plague doctor, armed with nothing more than a cane, a mask, and a cloak, ventures out into a world gone wild. Rats flee his approach, their squeaks echoing his own terror. The air grows thick with the stench of death. The sight of bloated bodies a grim reminder of his own mortality. And with each step the question looms, will this be my last journey? Yet despite the horrors he witnesses, the plague doctor soldiers on. He's bound by a code of ethics, a commitment to his calling. He doesn't choose his profession. He's chosen by circumstance and duty. And so he walks on, a lone figure in a sea of despair, hoping against hope that he might make a difference. But in the end, the plague catches up with him too. He succumbs to the very disease he's tried so hard to fight. And when the villagers find his body, they're not surprised. The plague doctor has become another casualty, another victim of the relentless plague. And as they bury him, they don't fear the disease any less. They just learn that even in the face of death, humanity endures. So the next time you hear the rattle of a carriage or the distant sound of a cough, remember the plague doctor. Remember his struggle, his sacrifice, and his ultimate fate. For he was not just a doctor, he was a symbol of our shared humanity, forever trapped in the darkest chapter of medieval history.